If you like the show, please give us a like and subscribe. If you'd like to learn more about specific legal issues, post about it in the comments or give us an email at juristjargon@gmail.com. Please enjoy today's show. Welcome to Jurist Jargon. We have a very interesting story to tell you today, but before we begin, just a reminder, what we're saying on the show is not legal advice. If you need an attorney, please seek one out. Don't make any decisions based on what we say in this podcast. Thanks. Now let's get into it. Alright, so today we have a very interesting show. There were 2 political scandals this week, some very interesting regulation news, and some very important questions about our culture that arose from a couple of legal cases that are beginning this week. To start, we're going to talk about the Kavanaugh problem that popped up this week. Robin Pogren and Kate Kelly wrote a book. These people are both New York Times reporters, and they wrote an article about it last Sunday in the New York Times. In their book, they claimed that Brett Kavanaugh sexually assaulted a woman at a Yale party 30 years ago. However, the problem is, the alleged victim claims she has no memory of the incident. And this brings up a couple of interesting legal questions, and so we'd like to get into it today.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that really struck me on the story is that even if the allegations happened as reported, it's definitely strange, but not unheard of, for someone to have their pants down at a party, but it wouldn't have been sexual assault. The allegation is that he was shoved or pushed into her. In order for the assault to have occurred and for him to be at fault for it, he had to have done it voluntary, I think. I think there'd just be a massive question of intent so far as, did he choose to put it there or did somebody choose to push him into her?
Well, I think you're starting off with the premise that this allegation is true, and I am having trouble getting even that far. To make that assumption, I think, is a bit far to go given the current evidence. Like I said, the victim claims that this never happened, or at the very least she has no memory of it. So where did this story come from?
Well, no, absolutely. I'm saying, even if we gave the story full credit, I still don't think it pans out in any meaningful way. My understanding is that the story was reported to them by one person. He wouldn't even go on the record with the allegation. We know that he's a man who runs or works for a nonprofit in the Washington area. I believe that he's been... I believe that who it is has been sourced out, or there's some pretty good evidence indicating who the rumor came from.
Look, I'm all for discussing impeachment or other things if this story was true, if there was some verifiable facts in this story, but there are none. Obviously, somebody who knew this woman claimed this happened because it ended up in, her name popped up in the book. I just have trouble understanding why these reporters would put something that they couldn't possibly verify in this book. It seems like it was out there solely to damage Kavanaugh. And I think we kind of get into the talk of Kavanaugh suing these people for this. And I think we should discuss kind of what defamation is, what it looks like, and what are really the requirements, especially in the special case of Brett Kavanaugh, because he qualifies as a public figure.
Yeah, absolutely. We get into that in 1 second. I do want to point out, so far as the potential malice in defamation, which we'll get to in a minute, I mentioned the purported source of the rumor, the alleged source of the rumor, actually would have been, again, according to rumor, somebody who was on Clinton's legal team, Bill Clinton's legal team, that is, when Brett Kavanaugh was working on Ken Starr's investigation into Bill Clinton. So the potential for malice, I think, might be there.
Well, let's talk about what it takes to get defamation, right? So in this case, it would be libel, which is one of 2 types of defamation. There's slander and libel. Libel's the written type of defamation. And to get defamation, you need a statement that is made that the person who made it knows is false, or in good conscience should have known it was false, and decided to put it out there, say it in a way that damaged the person who the statement is about. The problem becomes what is different about defamation in the case of a normal person and someone like Brett Kavanaugh, is that Brett Kavanaugh falls into this category of a public figure, or at least a limited purpose public figure. What that is that there are certain topics arise that get such an amount of news or knowledge in the general public that everybody kind of knows about this person. So a lot of people have stuff to say or hear things about this person that are reported to them. And because there's so many people having discussions about someone who arises in the news or whatnot, they get this classification as a public figure that makes it really hard to get defamation on them because the standard is so much higher. That standard is that you have to show actual malice on the part of the person who is slandering or committing libel. And we can define actual malice using Black's Law Dictionary. I mean, really, if this were a real case, we'd use case law, but for terms of just discussing it, I think Black's Law Dictionary is a good tool for describing what actual malice is. It says that actual malice is the deliberate intent to commit an injury as evidenced by external circumstances. That's a very basic definition. Really, we'd want more examples, but in this case, we have two people who wrote a book who had a unverifiable claim that in the book they also said the alleged victim says she did not remember and published it anyway. For me, that means that they know they can't verify this fact. In fact, they have evidence that would lead them to believe that there's a high potential that this didn't happen. And so the question becomes about their intent. What did they intend to do by publishing this fact?
Which I do think is an interesting piece here. And I actually still have some questions of what is in the book, how it's reported in the book. As I understand, in the book it's mentioned that she doesn't remember the incident. But it was also reported in the New York Times, I believe it was, where whichever outlet it was, both of these authors of the book are also writers for that news outlet. And in the story that was published, they ran a story basically saying, this is a new allegation about Brett Kavanaugh from this upcoming book. In that news story, they didn't report that she had no recollection of the accident. So I'm not sure about the publishing of the book itself, but the article about their book that they published through their paper definitely would raise the issue of defamation here.
Well, yes, because I think when you take that key fact away that the victim does not remember, you're skewing the story. And I think the only reason to skew the story like this is because it's more sensational. It has a larger negative effect. And the question is, did they mean to cause that negative effect? And I think it's difficult to say they didn't. The question is, did they intend to commit an injury? And I think we'd have to look to case law, but I'm almost certain case law, what we'd find is even if they did not directly intend to commit an injury, if they knew it had a high probability of committing an injury, they're probably also likely held responsible for that.
Right, and one thing that I would want to look into more, given the time, so far as defamation here goes, would actually be the potential slander suit against the individual who told them the story. I'd like to see in the case law if there's any way to kind of extend it to somebody who creates a rumor and like states it for the reporter to have some sort of source to report it. Another interesting take I'd want to look at here too is I think this timing is kind of interesting. Just a couple months ago, I was reading that Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court wants to revisit New York Times versus Sullivan. That's the case from 1964 that established this actual malice standard for public figures in a defamation suit. And I think it's interesting whether it actually is sound public policy to force public figures to have this higher standard because they're going to be more targeted.
I actually agree with it being a higher standard. I think it's difficult to say that every person who says something or claims something negative about a public figure, and it doesn't have to be someone who's, a public figure for national purposes. I mean, in your local town, if there was some negative press about a real estate developer, he'd probably be a limited person public figure for that. And I think that that higher standard, I think, is a good thing because it allows discussions to happen, and really, we have to clarify what is defamation, and that's a very amorphous, kind of difficult thing to clearly define everything that falls into defamation. It's kind of described now as kind of an umbrella term, and I think it's better to have the limiting factor being under certain circumstances for certain people it's harder to reach than kind of narrowing the definition of defamation, because that's what would need to happen if we opened defamation to a lower standard for public figures, because the courts would be flooded with lawsuits.
So, I don't think that it is right to have different standards for different people. Just as a base level stance, the law needs to apply to everyone equally. I just don't like the public figure standard. Additionally, my preferred system we actually used to have before New York Times versus Sullivan, there's a much greater emphasis on precedent before then about the truth. Historically, telling the truth was an affirmative defense to any defamation case. I can say the nastiest, most horrible things about you to attack your character. If they actually happened, and you couldn't disprove them, then I could not be held liable in any way. I think we need to get back to that and stop going in this speculative direction of, well, what can we verify, and was it malicious? I might be super malicious, but if I'm just telling the truth about you, I should be free to go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's already an element of defamation, is whether or not you told the truth. I mean, if you told the truth, then it's not defamation.
No, but I think the malice standard takes focus away from that element.
I agree, but I think the fact that it seems to me like you're saying that you would support a standard that says, well, you have to be telling the truth, or else it's defamation. And for me, that's a difficult standard, because I think there's oftentimes sources for reporters aren't tell the reporters things that they were not there to see for themselves, or don't have evidence of that. And if you're now saying that a reporter, to avoid defamation claims, needs to evidence the proof of their claim, even if they hear it from another party, a third source, then I think that would have negative public policy consequences, because I think the people would get less information. Like, I would rather get more information with the potential of it being false and make my own decision than have things that are likely true, but because reporters couldn't prove it, they chose not to tell the people.
But I think a major problem with the press, especially nowadays, that would actually be reversed by this, would be unqualified reporting by unnamed sources, where the press just says, somebody inside of the intelligence community or an unnamed source said this. Well, if they're actually held to a standard of truth, they can say that, like, well, we were told this by somebody, but it's unconfirmed. Without that emphasis, I think that they've really gotten lazy about qualifying their statements and trying to give the public an accurate understanding, not just of what was said, but how much verification there is of what was said.
I don't disagree, and my problem isn't that I disagree with you, because I think there is a lot of unverified news stories and a lot of lazy reporting that doesn't do much work to verify their stories. My problem becomes, I think what you are supporting is a system that is far too limiting, and it would cause much less information to get to the public, because I think there's lots of things that cannot be verified or proven that people are telling, the media's telling the people, that I think that people should be able to make up their own decision about, should be able to make up their own mind about. And some of those stories can't be verified. There's no way I can get a document proving some of the things they're saying. Like, we're going to get into the whistleblower call that occurred this week, but even if it did happen, and it was first-hand knowledge, I'm not sure that person could get verifiable proof of that happening, and so it was reporting of that defamation now on Donald Trump.
No, they just, and maybe we move on to this now, but I just say that they have to be clear about where this information's coming from and how much of it can be verified. I think that a lot of that rigor in reporting has fallen away because of this heightened standard.
Well, I think we're going to get that to in a little bit. We do have another story kind of about the Kavanaugh saga that I would like to get into now prior to talking about the whistleblower. This week, Leland Kaiser came forward and was talking kind of about her experience during the Kavanaugh hearings and how she felt pressured by people around Christine Blasey Ford to be more forthcoming with her story or perhaps even change her story. Would you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So again, this was directly spurred by that same book, with the allegation we were just discussing. Leland Kaiser is a supposed lifelong friend of Christine Blasey Ford. She was supposed to have been her witness who was at the party to corroborate her story about Brett Kavanaugh. And she's pretty consistently, there had been some prior reporting done about mutual friends of theirs pressuring her. She reportedly received an anonymous call at one point, just like telling her that she better support Christine Blasey Ford's story. And I think that one of the really interesting issues here that comes up legally is what we call suborning perjury and perjury itself. When you suborn perjury, you're making an agreement with somebody else for them to testify falsely. Right? So right here, whoever it was, it depends if they were pressuring Leland Kaiser, were they ordering her, were they threatening her, what exact conversations were happening trying to cause her to support Christine Blasey Ford that would have led her to say that she remembered something that she didn't.
I think that this story is incredibly important. And I think it's important that it doesn't get buried, because I'm sure very few major news sources are really going to want to shine a spotlight on this because they all covered the Kavanaugh hearing so closely. I think this is important because it really makes a statement to how our system of government is, at this point, pushing in a very negative direction. I mean, here is open corruption trying to force a person to say something under oath that they don't believe because it supports a political position. I mean, if you truly believed Christine Blasey Ford, you wouldn't try to come to an agreement with somebody who has no recollection of this, who doesn't believe in her story, and say, we want you to say something that you don't believe in. Wouldn't you find somebody who did know and have them speak out about it? And, I mean, I know we didn't hold a criminal trial for Brett Kavanaugh. He was never charged with the crime. But, I mean, we did have essentially a trial in the court of public opinion. I mean, the hearings for Brett Kavanaugh's judicial selection were widely watched by many people.
Statements in a congressional hearing like that are taken under oath. So that it would be perjury, actually, to lie to Congress in that situation.
Well, I mean that's a crime for her. I was talking about just the general proceedings. But, I mean, it really does speak to, I think, the state of politics in our country, and it's really kind of a negative statement.
No, I do think it's a negative statement, but I do question actually looking in here at the elements of suborning perjury and perjury itself, whether this crime actually would have been committed, or whether we could actually, in what situations like this could have occurred. First of all, one of the elements of suborning perjury is that the perjury has to be committed. So it's not enough to make someone agree to lie under oath or to threaten them to lie under oath. They actually have to be called under oath. Leland Kaiser was never made any statements under oath, so she couldn't have committed the perjury. And even if she had, the person who's coercing her or convincing her to lie also needs to know that that her statements would be false. So it kind of depends on what the statement would be.
I suppose that's true, but I mean the idea that she was pressured, even if she didn't commit the crime, and even if they haven't technically suborned perjury, it seems to be like they've were at least attempting to conspire to do that. And I mean, not necessarily in the legal term, although that is quite possibly something that those who pressured her might be charged with or could be charged with. But just from a public policy standpoint, the idea that we have people who believe a story about a person potentially committing a crime, pressuring someone else to give testimony they don't believe, with what I assume, and this might not be correct, but I think it's not a far leap to make, would be the intent of furthering their political objectives rather than truly helping Christine Blasey Ford.
Yeah, and that's another thing too. It's not only that Leland Kaiser doesn't remember the Blasey Ford story happening. She said previously in another book that was published, Justice on Trial, she said, quote, "I don't have any confidence in the story," end quote. Saying that not only does she not remember that happening, but she does not believe that it happened at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a bad look for the political system. I'm upset that there were, that this has to do with the judicial system, or at least somebody high up on the judicial system, because I think the judicial system's not meant to be politicized, and it really has been in the last couple years. It's supposed to be kind of, I mean, I don't want to be pretentious, but it's kind of meant to be this noble thing kind of set apart from politics, and I don't think I think for a long time it hasn't achieved that goal.
No, so I think that the judiciary itself has always been politicized, so far as both sides picking well-qualified justices that they like, that kind of support, that whose judicial theories support their prescribed policy. But it has gotten very invidious so far as the confirmation voting, how far politics is willing to reach into the judiciary. For example, two of the most politically divisive people on the courts would be Scalia and Ginsburg. Both were approved by overwhelming majorities in the Senate.
Well, I think there are some real questions about Ginsburg. Not that I don't think she's a qualified judge, but I mean, what organization was she in charge of prior to being picked to the court?
I do not remember the organization, but she was very, very much involved in pro-abortion advocacy.
Was it the ACLU?
I believe she was general counsel for a pro-abortion nonprofit.
Well, either way, it would be the equivalent of electing the head of the NRA to be a Supreme Court justice. It's a very political choice, and I think that I think Scalia is a better example than she is, just because of her even further political association.
Well, I think she's actually a better example for the point I was trying to make, was when you voted, politics was involved in choosing to nominate her, but when the senators voted, they were just saying whether or not they thought she was politically qualified, not whether they thought that her decisions based on her politics would line up with their policy positions. That has faded away.
Yes, and that's what's supposed to happen. I mean, it's much more partisan now. You see people voting down their party lines. And what is more of a problem for me, and it kind of goes hand in hand with this, is the political litmus tests that you see go on. Where, you have to have this political view or we're not going to vote for you. You have to be pro-abortion or you must have a certain interpretation of the Constitution.
Right. Definitely. Also trying to... I've seen some cases recently of trying to inject almost religious tests into it. Which senator is it? From California. Dianne Feinstein told a judge who was up for the Seventh Circuit, Amy Coney Barrett, that the dogma lives loudly inside of you. And I was like, specifically the Constitution says that you can't have religious tests for office. Maybe lay off dogma during a judicial nomination hearing. I don't know.
You know what? It all combines to say that the judicial system's kind of in a precarious position right now. Not that anything's going to happen, but I mean, there's certainly been discussions by both sides discussing how they can maintain a majority in the Supreme Court, and that I think that's a really negative thing, especially when you have people talking about adding more justices when they get a supermajority in Congress along with the presidency, and using that to adjust how many justices there are to artificially create a majority I think that's just a really bad look for the judiciary. It's really bad for the country, and I think we're kind of in trouble there.
Yeah, though possibly not. Things like this aren't unprecedented. We talked about before the kind of political maneuvering and forethought that had to be incorporated into Marbury versus Madison. FDR has proposed court packing in the past, and that was largely a non-issue, though partially because they all just started agreeing with whatever he wanted to do. But it's concerning, but also possible that this too will come to pass, and in the end, nothing will have changed. It'll kind of peter out and then boil up again at another time.
My point would, but wouldn't it change? I mean, we are in an incredibly contentious judicial period for this country on a national level with regards to the Constitution. I mean, there's lots of questions that people are questioning, the Heller versus DC case, discussing whether or not citizens have the right to own guns. Roe v. Wade is still a big question mark about whether or not people are questioning overturning that. There's a lot of things from the Supreme Court that really are going to come under fire, I think, in the next few years, especially if there becomes a large majority in the court for one side or the other.
But I think that historically that's kind of always been true, and I think this is something that more goes through periods. Between Andrew Jackson with the Seminole Indians, when he just totally ignored a Supreme Court order, to just bad precedent. Plessy v. Ferguson, Wickard v. Filburn, the Dred Scott decision. There's always been constitutional crises involving the court. I think they ebb and flow a bit, and I don't know if... I don't think we should be battening down the hatches quite yet on a constitutional crisis with the court.
Well, I think that's enough on that topic for the day. Let's move on to our next major political scandal this week, because one's not enough. So, this week, there was a whistleblower in the intelligence community that reported about Trump's foreign phone call with Ukraine. You kind of looked at the facts for that. Can you give them now?
Right. So the initial report was that this intelligence official had knowledge of a phone call between Trump and the leader of Ukraine, and Trump was supposedly encouraging this leader. Trump's actually admitted at this point that he was encouraging the leader to look into Joe Biden. Joe Biden's time as VP. While Joe Biden was the vice president, his son Hunter Biden was on the board of an energy company that was owned by a Ukrainian businessman. And so Trump was calling for an investigation of this scenario that came up where the prosecutor general of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, was pressured to resign by his own government because Joe Biden pressured the government. The issue here, and there's definitely some issues with Shokin, murmurings of corruption, other tangential issues, but at the time Shokin was investigating this energy firm that Joe Biden's son worked for. And so Trump's basically asking the Ukrainian government to look into this whole situation.
And so I think this is kind of a two-part scandal, and on one for each party, right? Because there's this question of, the legality of what either party did, and it's really a discussion of quid pro quo, right? As far as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, as long as you ask someone to do something and don't offer them something in return, like, I don't know, funds or government money, then you haven't actually committed a crime. If you just ask, hey, would you look into what happened with, Joe Biden, his son, and their relationships with Ukraine at this period of time, that, as long as he doesn't offer anything, wouldn't be illegal. And as sad as it is, it certainly wouldn't be the first time a president has done something like that, whether or not you think doing that in the first place is right. And I think that's kind of the first, scandal that happened, and that's with Trump, whether or not there was that quid pro quo. And then there's one with, whether or not Joe Biden was motivated by helping his son. I mean, that's a problem if he had a quid pro quo there. I mean, it's the same question at different times for both of them, and I think they're equally important.
So that is true. I do think the questions cut different ways, kind of. So, like you said, generally a quid pro quo would be illegal, unless it's, there are certain contexts where quid pro quo is fine. That's basically what a treaty is. That's how diplomacy works. Under the table, of course. There's also some things you can ask for, where just asking for them would be illegal, or at least highly unethical. That's not really at issue here, but it is an important distinction to make, I think. I think that the major question here is that the question here is that Trump asked for something that, if he offered a quid pro quo, would be illegal. Joe Biden definitively had a quid pro quo. We were offering the Ukrainians $1 billion in guaranteed loans, and Joe Biden was basically sent over there to work out the deal. And he said, listen, he was actually assured that this prosecutor would be fired beforehand. And he said that he wasn't actually going to approve the loans. He wasn't going to sign off on negotiations until he was fired. So that's certainly a quid pro quo relationship. But the question is, based on his intent, was it an illegal quid pro quo?
Yeah, I do think the questions of fact are different, right? Because we're talking about Joe Biden's intent, and we're talking about whether or not Trump or gave his pro quo, right?
Right.
So but ultimately the overarching legal question is the same, whether or not they had this illegal quid pro quo. How do you think it interacts politically for both of them?
Yeah, so I think that no matter how these come out, it is not a good situation for either of them, certainly. Trump, even without having established a pro quo, I think this is gonna look pretty bad for him. Might come around to him in the election coming up. If he did establish a pro quo, we might be talking impeachment, depending on if he offered something, what he offered. Joe Biden's end, I think this again hurts him no matter what. If Ukraine actually delivers on this investigation, let's say, and specifically he was talking about getting rid of this prosecutor because of how it might impact his son's board position or job, he's probably wrapping up his campaign. He's smart enough politically, I think, to just know, I'm stepping out of this.
Well, my question would be is there anything that, if that were to be true, would that bar him from seeking political office?
I don't think so. Even if he was convicted on this as a felony, you can run a political campaign for president from prison. Again, it's going to severely limit his chances, but he would still meet all the constitutional requirements.
Let's move on to our next story, which hopefully is both sides should feel good about this. I wanted to say it was nonpartisan, but that's not true. Both sides should feel this is a good thing, despite this being worse off for one of the parties, and that is Judge Carmine DiPaolo has been fined by the disciplinary board after the U.S. Office of Special Counsel filed a complaint against her for violating the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act is a law that states that certain federal employees cannot act in certain political manners while they hold office. And judges are one of the people who are under the most scrutiny under this act. And what Carmine DiPaolo did is that during Hillary Clinton's campaign, she went to a rally and she helped campaign and discuss and promote Hillary Clinton's immigration plan, which, when we get down into it, really is kind of a fundamental violation of the Hatch Act. So the key thing to know about the Hatch Act is that federal employees can participate in campaigns, they can be involved in managing campaigns. However, they're not allowed to use the authority of their position to give weight behind certain political ideas or seek political outcomes. So in this case, Judge Carmine DiPaolo sought to promote Hillary Clinton's immigration plan to see it come through fruition by her getting elected. That's kind of cut and dry a violation. So she was fined a monetary amount, and since then she has chosen to retire. But she was also banned from seeking federal office for a number of years. And while this does cut political because she did support a Democrat, it really shouldn't. And this is something everyone should feel good about, in the idea that at some level we're trying to make sure that the judiciary stays out of politics.
Right. I think that this interestingly, I had some reservations when I first started thinking about it, because I think that it's difficult for this person to give their professional authority, their legal opinion, not as a judge but as an attorney, which is a set of training they have. And I was like, well, then if I'm an attorney in any capacity for the federal government, can I not give any sense of legal opinion within a campaign? Obviously, that's not what happened here. It was just kind of like a knee-jerk reaction I had to be like, this is really unfair to somebody to say they can't use a general specialized skill set in the context of a campaign. By coming out to say, like, I as a judge, or in my legal opinion, well, you are a judge, think that this is legal, or sorry, constitutional. I'm not sure exactly what their statement was on the policy.
They just supported her immigration policy. They kind of disparaged the current policy on immigration. I don't remember the exact quote, but my problem with it is she's supporting a certain outcome. Like, even if the current the current policy outcome is not something she agrees with, she has to uphold it, and so she promotes a certain changing of the law when she's meant to uphold it, and she hides behind her authority as a judge, like, hey, I'm an immigration judge, I'm saying this is what the policy should be. You're giving a certain level of authority to your decision, to your analysis, that should make you more credible. And I think using the credibility as a federal employee to support your personal political outcome is not a great thing. And that's why the Hatch Act exists.
Right, and I don't think, like, James Ho on the Fifth Circuit, rather originalist judge, does a lot of immigration stuff. He's not going around telling people that he thinks, building a border wall is good policy that should be upheld. I wouldn't want him doing that. He doesn't do that. I think this is a good standard to have in place on both sides. So, thankfully, we're moving on from politics, and we're going to look at a story coming at us here from Chicago. 4 students at Wheaton College have filed a federal free speech lawsuit against the city. They are members of the Chicago evangelism team for their university, and they have been prevented by city officials from sharing the gospel inside of Millennium Park. For those who don't know, the Bean is a very popular sculpture in Chicago, which is in Millennium Park. According to the lawsuit, they were told by officials, quote, soliciting the public to subscribe to their beliefs, and therefore they were told by officials within the city of Chicago that they were, quote, soliciting the public to subscribe to their beliefs and were in violation of the Chicago ordinance, which prohibited solicitation in the park sidewalk. As of April, the park is divided into 11 rooms, according to the park. This is kind of a response to their lawsuit and their issues with these students. And so in the 11 different rooms or areas of the park, they allow for solicitation in one, but it's one of the least popular areas in the park, very far away from the attractions people typically go to Millennium Park for. And their goal with this lawsuit, what they're trying to accomplish, is to prevent the implementation of any policy which they say restricts their free speech in a public forum.
And I think this gets into more abuse by government. I mean, it's less political, but it certainly talks to, government abuse of power. I think it's becoming an increasingly large issue to see different, areas governed, whether it be colleges or local governments, govern people's ability to use their speech how they want to. I mean, the limitations of speech are growing vastly, and the support for the limitation of free speech is growing. And I think it's really a negative thing. I think it's something we need to be quite aware of. It was one thing when it was limited to college campuses, and there I think it's a problem because that's supposed to be a center for free speech, but I think it's becoming a larger issue when you're having local governments using ordinances kind of as clubs to beat people who have ideas that they don't like on the head for, just espousing those ideas in public forums.
Right, and I think that's a really important question here is, some people might be thinking, you can restrict time, manner, and place of speech. But there's a lot of limitations on that. For one thing, you're not supposed to be able to do it in a public forum. So the real issue here is that more and more places are being determined to not be public forums. Just historical public forums, universities, as you mentioned, were almost considered just de facto public forums. And so that really limits when you can actually restrict speech, when you can require a permit, what reason has to be behind the restriction of speech. And I actually think that's where these college students get it really good here, is what is Chicago's reason for restricting the speech. As I understand it, they believe that the solicitation, the trying to bring someone else to worship your faith, is something that may be considered objectively offensive, which is almost a nonsensical formulation.
I think that every religion should be allowed to say what they want. It seems like these persecutions, though, are only happening to Christians. I don't know whether the local government would have said the same thing if it had been someone, espousing Judaism or, Islam. But you don't hear stories like that. What we constantly see lately are stories of Christians having their free speech limited. And the idea that only Christianity, of all the religions, somehow is offensive compared to every other religion, it is kind of crazy.
No, I absolutely do, and here we don't have the data. I do think it's something to be worried about, is persecution of a certain religion, not because they're weak and vulnerable, but because people think it's okay because they're big. This actually is the case, as I understand it. I don't want to go international for too long, but one of the most famous historic public forums in the world is Speaker's Corner in London. It's a large open-air market, and they've had some pretty serious issues lately with the police basically allowing intimidation and restrictions of any religious proselytizing except for Muslim proselytization. Or, solicitation, we can call it.
Sure, but the defining difference between us and them is that we have a Constitution, a Bill of Rights that protects our speech under the First Amendment. That's kind of what makes America different and very special, is that we are theoretically supposed to be protecting our individual rights in a way that most other countries don't provide those protections from the government to the people.
So you're right. The reason that I bring this up is that under the UK Constitution, their standard for free speech restrictions, which again they believe in an individual right to free speech, but they construct it and limit it more broadly, is that they can restrict speech which is objectively offensive, and that's the same language that Chicago is using here to limit solicitation. That it's something that may be considered objectively offensive.
I just don't know where you would find the standard to make that objective. It seems kind of like you said, nonsensical. But I think we've beaten that horse to death. So kind of another case that has come up this week that really makes me concerned for the culture and the way our society's moved. Here's a case of a 6-year-old girl in Florida who was arrested for battery at Lucius and Emma Nixon Elementary Charter School. So this little girl, she threw a tantrum, as small children are like to do, and she was sent to the head office. Once she was there, a member of the staff grabbed both her wrists, purportedly to try and calm her down, and the little girl kicked the staff member. At that point, the police were called. The little girl was then charged with battery, taken to the police station, fingerprinted, and now has a court date moving forward.
Yeah, this case is just absolutely ridiculous. First of all, I think one of the most important things to note here is that the staff member did grab her wrists, at least according to the story I'm reading. that in itself is a battery.
Sure. If I recall correctly, battery consists of the the intended attempt, or sorry, the intended contact, whether it be in a way that physically harms another person, or what we describe as quote unquote offensive contact of another person, and the contact actually happens. So in this case, this little girl was grabbed both her wrists, and presumably, in some way physically restrained. Even if she wasn't hurt by this, that to me that seems offensive. You touched a little girl, physically restraining her. You're not her parent, even if there are limited guardian rights at schools of staff over children. It just seems very abnormal. The physical restraint seems abnormal.
Right, and once the battery occurs, once one party commits a battery, the other party acting in response, typically, I'm sure in Florida, has an affirmative defense here of self-defense. She was trying to defend herself from this teacher. Now, if there's some sort of exception here, if there's some sort of exception here for like a staff member in a school, I don't really think that vindicates the little girl. That might vindicate the teacher, but I don't see how the little girl is still liable.
And sure, maybe we should describe what an affirmative defense is, just to give a quick idea. An affirmative defense, and this differs from normal defenses, is that an affirmative defense basically says, yes, I did the thing you're claiming I did. However, even if I did it, I have an excuse for doing it that makes me not liable for that crime. And to me, it's just really a cultural problem, right? Because we're talking about a small girl who kicked an adult in a tantrum. Is it right? No. Should the child probably be disciplined? Probably. However, you're telling me that the proper discipline for this child is to create a juvenile record for her, send her to get fingerprinted in the back of a police car after she's been handcuffed, and then set a court date? That's the appropriate punishment for her? Like what is this world coming to? I don't know a child who at some point hasn't, lashed out in anger. It's not right, but they're children. They have to learn not to do that. And the appropriate way to teach them is not to get them sent to jail in the back of a squad car.
Yeah, that's one thing, too. We focused a lot here on this little girl, the bad thing that happened to her, what her responsibility is for what she did. But what about this police officer? As I understand it, to arrest a juvenile, or I think they had some arbitrary age in there, like somebody
12.
under 12. Yeah, anybody under 12. He should have, according to their policy, contacted his commanding officer. That wasn't done here. It's just an improper following of police procedure, which I think all too often causes these sort of these issues between law enforcement and the public, whether they're warranted or not. It's just not abiding by existing policies.
Sure, but I think it's a scapegoat to push this blame off on the police officer. I think we can certainly talk about whether the police officer followed policy or not. But how many poor decisions by authority were there to get to here? So instead of calling the child's parent to have them sort this out, or their guardian, you called the police, or you had the police intervene. And so some staff member, probably multiple, came to that conclusion, informed the police officer, who then made a judgment that didn't follow their policy, and this is how this happened. And for me, how is this the response? How is a 6-year-old child, the response is to have the police deal with them? You have to have the understanding that these children are not, of the maturity to understand that what they're doing is wrong all the time. That's why we're teaching them. You have to teach this girl that what she did's wrong. And the idea that this is the appropriate response, it just baffles me. It scares me for how we're treating youth moving forward. The scary thing is, and it's not, it wasn't a huge part of the story, but this was not even the only child arrested this day. I believe there was like an 8-year-old or something as well arrested this day. And it totally boggles my mind that this is how our culture is treating children, that, in how we raise them. We're no longer going to parents. We no longer trust parents to discipline their children. Now the police have to be involved, in the bureaucracy of government must be involved in every aspect of child rearing now. And we've really seen the erosion of parental rights in this country.
No, it reminds me very much of Sparta almost. I had my background in political science, and one thing that actually happened for a long time in history, a lot of countries didn't actually look to Athens an ideal government. A lot of countries for a very long time looked to Sparta. And I feel like we're reverting almost to a Spartan kind of idea that like the government owns your child. Like this child is the property of the society. The society will educate them, they will raise them, and they will respond to their temper tantrums. We got away with that. We went with more of an Athenian model in the United States, and I think we're reverting in a bad way.
No, absolutely. But I think that the reason that we went kind of with the quote-unquote Athenian model is because we enshrined individual rights. And part of those rights were your rights as a parent to your children. And the problem is the growing government, right? We have governments growing larger and larger, whether it be state governments or federal governments, having a larger and larger part in everyday life of the citizens, which is, for me, is a terrible thing. I think the government should be small, and that I think it's patently obvious the private market just does a better job at achieving goals than the government does. The government has too much bureaucracy. There's no competition when the government does it. It can't achieve as well of outcomes as the private market in most things. And that includes child rearing.
I agree with you. I obviously think of it more through a political science lens than an economic one. I think we're going to have to give our listeners like a reading list, maybe Will and Dave suggested books for like an informed citizenry or something.
That would be pretty funny.
But yeah, I'm just like, this wouldn't happen if people knew Locke, if they knew Tocqueville, if they read Rousseau. This is like the Rousseauian idea of belonging to your government. I think that's a bad idea, and I think people need to know what the idea is. But yeah, I don't think that a state law enforcement officer needs to respond to a 6-year-old kicking someone. I've been kicked by a lot of 6-year-olds. I have younger siblings. It's not something you call a cop for.
All right, for our last story for the day, the FTC has decided they're going to start investigating social media companies like Facebook and Google for antitrust violations. Facebook has recently acquired WhatsApp and Instagram, and the FTC believes that these large media companies have potentially been stifling competition and buying out their competitors so that they can raise prices for ads.
So I'm not quite sure how I feel about the way this has been conducted. Generally, there's two theories on antitrust. One is that you need to break up big companies. The other is that you need to break up anti-competitive big companies. Now, it looks to me like the FTC is actually looking for anti-competitive behaviors, but their probable cause to start investigating in the first place doesn't seem to be based on anything other than the fact that Facebook's really big.
I would totally disagree with that. I think the fact that Facebook has been buying up other large companies, primarily Instagram more than WhatsApp, but the fact they're buying other large companies that are kind of in the same industry as them has really given them an unnatural bargaining power. And this actually comes out right after Facebook was just hit with a massive fine for dealing with personal data privacy breaches.
So I think that the personal data issue is different and very important to me. That's actually something I think we'd agree on a lot more. My problem is that in acquiring those companies, I don't think that's anti-competitive. I think they're just throwing around their wallet, and I don't see any evidence that they are using their market share to pressure these companies into agreeing to unfavorable terms for a merger. If these companies are agreeing to sell to Facebook because they're offering a good price, and I haven't seen, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen anything to contradict that, I'm okay with Facebook buying them out if they're doing it fair and square.
Well, I think we're talking about two different things. One, I think the privacy issue is very closely entwined with this because these large media companies make quite a bit of money by selling your personal data to different advertisers and other people online. So I think the issue of whether or not anti-competitive behavior, price gouging, and your personal data are very closely tied together. But further from that, I don't think that antitrust only has to do by forcing companies into mergers at disadvantageous terms. Antitrust also has to do with just regularly merging and buying out other companies, getting too large a market share, and committing either, conspiracy to create monopolies or doing acts that create monopolies. And I think Facebook, in this area has a huge market share. I don't know if I would quite call it, a monopoly at this point, but it's certainly a very tiny oligopoly, which is a few different firms control basically the entirety of the market share. And by buying Instagram out, they took out one of their most major competitors. At this point, if they decide to raise prices, especially on things like ads, or start selling personal data at higher prices and collecting it more, this would be a antitrust behavior by the definition set out by the FTC for antitrust behavior.
Right, but my problem is that I don't actually see any evidence of these anti-competitive behaviors. Perhaps Facebook has the capacity to act in this way, but I'm not seeing that there is any evidence of extreme price gouging, that there is any evidence of manipulating the market to oppress other potential competitors. If they offer to buy a competitor and they agree to an acquisition, I don't think that's necessarily anti-competitive behavior unless there's evidence of abuse of their size.
Well, I think we're getting to a different. I think we're not on the same page here, because I think when we're talking about antitrust, it's not that you have to act in a non-competitive manner. Merely having the monopoly sets you up in a position that we don't want you to be in, because you have too much market share, too much control over the market. And I think that in itself is the problem. But we should also know that at this point, the FTC has merely said they're going to start investigating and devoting quite a bit of resources to investigating companies like Facebook and Google and other large tech companies. I believe there's something like the attorney generals for 8 different states and Washington, D.C. have all signed on to this investigation.
Yeah.
So that's really what we're saying. Action is not being taken yet. It's just the beginning of an investigation. But that is a big deal, because this investigation would not be happening if these different attorney generals didn't see smoke.
Right, which is what I was getting at first of all. It seems as though they're going to look for actual manipulative behaviors before they step in. I just don't like that the initiation of their investigation was based on the idea that it's not good for them to be too big. Now, they're actually going to look to see what's going on behind closed doors and how Facebook is potentially influencing the market. That's an interesting twist, I think, to this antitrust case, as opposed to many of them, is the tech companies like Google and Facebook work within the marketing industry. And so how they affect the market is not just based on their outward behavior, their business activity, but actually like influence through the product that they provide. For example, Rockefeller's oil company, he can have all the shady business practices he wants, undercutting, having huge undercut sales to price out new competitors in the market. That's all very transparent, but it's not easy to understand how Facebook and Google, companies like that, can manipulate marketing to affect the market through their product and not through their business practices.
I think you have to first ask, what is the market that would be manipulated? And I don't think that they'd use their marketing to manipulate a different market. I think the market that would be manipulated is Facebook ads, is Instagram ads, Google ads, AdWords and AdSense and that type of thing. That is the market that would be manipulated. And I think it's difficult to see when monopolies are manipulating prices, because all they do is adjust their prices, right? It doesn't appear to be price gouging, just prices go up. And because there really isn't another person to go to, or there's very few other places to go to besides, the very small handful of companies that run, these social media companies, they become the only people to provide these ads. And when they raise their prices, there's no competition occurring. There's nobody who can compete with them because they're so big. And when competition does arise, they immediately buy them out, allowing them to once again have, dominance over this market. Therefore, the market for marketing is what we're really talking about being abused. And it's really just, watching the creep in prices rise up. All right, well, I think that wraps up our show today. This is David and Will signing off, but if you have any specific legal questions, stuff you'd like us to go through and explain, please shoot us an email at juristjargon@gmail.com. Thanks. Please tune in next week.
See you next week, guys.